Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Keeley. I'm with the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. And before we get started here this afternoon, I just want to make a couple of really brief announcements. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. We'll share those links with you in the chat function on this webinar. Everyone but the speakers will have their cameras off and microphones muted. So please use the Q&A feature if you would like to ask a question of any one of our panelists today. For those of you who tweet, we would love to have you tweet about this webinar and the topics that are addressed using the hashtag supporting caregivers. Just a brief mention about the Business Roundtable and about the coalition. The Roundtable is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy organization that's comprised of CEOs and senior business leaders from major employers all across the state. We're thrilled to work with our member companies, leaders in business, state government, nonprofits, higher education, as part of the Massachusetts Caregivers Coalition, which was launched in November of 2019. And our goal really is to support the work of volunteer family caregivers everywhere. I want to especially thank our good friends at the Executive Office of Elder Affairs and member of Governor Baker's Council to Address Aging, which set an ambitious and laudable goal of making the Commonwealth of Massachusetts the most age-friendly state for people of all ages. This is the second in our free webinar series to raise awareness and share stories and provide practical resources and tips to help support volunteer family caregivers. May being National Mental Health Awareness Month, the coalition is proud to come together today to address challenges and help reduce the stigma facing caregivers during these difficult times and give some practical resources and guides to help with all of our mental health during this time of COVID-19. We invite you to join the growing and vibrant coalition that is supporting caregivers if you haven't already, and we'll share links and an email address for you to do just that. We have people joining us this afternoon from all around the country. We thank you for being here, for being with us, for sharing your strength and your stories and your tips with all of us. Following the webinar, you'll receive a survey that we hope you'll fill out. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know what you'd like to see in future webinars. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. And now it's really my pleasure to turn things over to our moderator this afternoon, Michael Shipman. He's the Vice President and Director of Talent Development for Rockland Trust, which is a member of the Roundtable. And Rockland is an absolutely terrific employer that has led the way in supporting family caregivers, working and encouraging their employees to bring their whole self to work at the bank. I'll let Michael tell you more about RockFit, which is a great program that they launched to help the wellness of their employees at the bank. And as I turn things over now to him to lead this important discussion, I thank you all for being here. And Michael, please get us started. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me here. It's a real honor to talk to this panel. We're here to discuss the challenges, be inspired by stories, and share resources for caregivers. In our audience today, we spanning all across America, and we're talking to leaders, HR professionals from the public and the private sector. We've got a very impressive panel. So let's meet them. We've got Christine Biaggi Bridges. She's an IT business partner at Dell. We've got Dr. Naomi Pollock. She's a licensed social worker and the Director of Clinical Content Development at Able2. And Jennifer Raymond, Chief Strategic Officer and Director at Healthy Living Center of Excellence. This is Elder Services of Merrimack Valley and North Shore. So you can see that we've got a very smart, very credentialed group, very experienced leaders on the panel today. So let's get down to it. We have first panelist, Christine. And you've got a very personal story that you'd like to share. How about we start there?
Okay, thank you, Michael. Welcome, everybody. I'm honored to have been asked to share my story today. And I'm going to talk about my caregiving journey and how mental health and employer supports have impacted myself and my family in our daily life. And this is all really kind of relevant in light of what's going on in the world today as well. So first, I'm a mom to 3 children. 2 have different abilities. Kayla is 25, and she has a diagnosis of trio and mitochondrial disease. Matthew is 16, and he has a diagnosis of Landau-Kleffner and is on the autism spectrum. Jake is 25, and he's an MBA candidate at the Eisenberg School of Business at UMass Amherst. So I have quite the contrast going on in the house right now. Kayla is nonverbal. She uses a wheelchair for mobility. She can crawl a little bit. She does receive nursing services at home. She attends an adult day program, and she loves boys, shopping, and being social in the community. Kayla loves to hug people. She especially loves to hug big Patriot football players, and she's a celebrity in her own mind. Matthew attends a day program at the Boston Higashi School in Randolph. He is curious, loves rock and roll, and likes to be super busy. Yesterday, he announced that he's going to fly the Life Flight helicopters because he has an obsession with the police, the fire, the EMTs, and anything related to heavy equipment. He has a mind like a steel trap. He can remember little tiny details from activities, what people were wearing, even what color car they drove 10 years ago. And that just boggles my mind. So here's a little history. Throughout my life, I've always worked. I grew up on a farm in New Hampshire. I had to milk the cows before school and finish the day with chores. We raised all of our own food, canned the fruits and vegetables, heated the farmhouse with firewood, and we had cows, pigs, chicken, geese, sheep, and it was a lot of hard work, but I learned to be very self-sufficient, and I think this is key to my journey. While I was at home, I ran winter and spring track. As a 7th grader, I made the varsity team, so I ran for 6 years, and I lettered in all 12 seasons. Eventually, as I got older, I traded the farm for an engineering degree. Imagine the culture shock of the New Hampshire farm girl landing in downtown Boston to attend Wentworth Institute of Technology. That self-sufficiency skill was key. My parents could not afford to send me to college, but I was determined not to live on that farm forever. I got a co-op job at Northrop, and they paid for my last 2 years of school. So during this time, I worked full-time, went to school evenings and weekends, and I was able to graduate on time with my class and with no debt. I was, at that point, I'm out into the workforce, and I'm 28 years old, and I find out that my 4-week-old baby is a little bit different. And that perfect world has now become a world of chaos and many challenges. So Kayla was born in 1995. It took us 3 years to get her first diagnosis. We spent a good portion of those first 6 years in and out of Boston Children's Hospital, and I was devastated. I quickly learned that I was not in control. And being an engineer and a type A personality, this was causing me a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress. So this was my first experience with any sort of mental health assistance. And I got a great counselor to help me navigate, at that time, my new normal. The next 8 years, caring for Kayla, I was working with employers that allowed me to have some creativity and flexibility in my schedule. I needed to work to keep my sanity, but I also needed to maintain our health insurance. Sometimes I worked from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. Maybe I worked Wednesday to Sunday, or even there was a period of time where I worked remotely from the hospital in order to juggle both my work and Kayla's needs. So learning that juggling act was important to be able to take care of Kayla, work a full-time job, and run a household. I really learned to be organized and creative with time management. Everything was run by a project plan. I learned a lot from advocating for Kayla and managing my desire to work in high tech. During this time of learning, my desire in work shifted from being in that small startup mentality to a more corporate vision. So in 2003, I joined EMC, which is now Dell, and I was very upfront in that hiring process about Kayla and her needs. I stated to them, this is my life, but with Dell's support, I can give you 110% and I can do a fantastic job. And I really didn't want to work for a company that wouldn't support my need for that work-life balance. So I found that being open about my personal story had allowed me at that time to help others in their journey for flexibility in their workspace. So we fast forward to 2005. Kayla's dad passes away at the age of 42 from a heart attack. And now I'm a single mother of a 10-year-old medically complex child. Once again, I seek out mental health treatment to help me deal with grief, depression, and anxiety. And I have to say, that's a point in time where, any of the opportunities that you have with an employer for services, utilize it. I did, and it helped me move forward. In 2011, I meet Brian, who has 2 sons, one on the autism spectrum. At that time, Matthew was 4. And I'm quickly immersed in the world of autism. I was grateful for everything that I learned with Kayla so that now I could help Matt obtain and receive the services and education that he needed. We spent a lot of time with an advocate, finding the correct placement for him and getting him the services he needed. So now he has the skill set to be a very independent, functioning young man. So in 2013, Kayla and I run the Boston Marathon, and we are the first mother-daughter team in the 117-year history. And why is this year significant? It was the year of the bombing. We were 30 yards from the first bomb, almost at the finish line, and Kayla was oblivious to all the noise and commotion. She thinks that the fireworks and all of the, she thinks the bomb were fireworks and all of that noise and stuff around her was a celebration of her accomplishment. We never let her know anything different. So to this day, she thinks that all of that was for her. I, on the other hand, had survivor's guilt. We made history that day, but 4 individuals lost their lives. Again, I utilized the tools in my mental health toolkit. Remember I said Matthew likes first responders? Well, every year we go to the marathon finish area and hang out at Engine 33. Since 2013, Matt has met the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the FBI, the SWAT. We've kept the marathon bombing positive for him as well. And as we continue to move forward in our lives, technology has been catching up as well. There's been a lot of work in gene sequencing and, the study of DNA. So when Kayla was 22, we had some blood drawn, both she and I, because they wanted to do something called exome sequencing. And it would tell us if there was, anything else going on in her life. And we had done it every few years because she wasn't really fitting that mold of what her mitochondrial disease was. She had the signs and the symptoms, but she wasn't having any regression, which was unusual. So we had the blood drawn in June, and that November we got a call saying they had discovered something. So Kayla now has a new primary diagnosis, and it's something called trio. I had no idea what this was. And she is the 20th person in the world to be diagnosed with this. And I'll give you a little definition that can kind of hopefully put it in perspective. Trio is a gene and it sits on your 5th chromosome. It's related to having an intellectual disability, and it's characterized by the delay in motor and language skills, some intellectual disability, and maybe some neurobehavioral problems. And what's interesting is it includes autistic traits, the autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and in some cases aggression. There are issues with feeding when they're babies, and their inability to suck correctly and failure to thrive. And when we look back at this now, we say, wow, this was Kayla, because she did have failure to thrive. She did have a hard time gaining weight, sucking on her bottle. And she also has had some characteristics around her face and hands that the doctors kept saying, that just doesn't make sense. It looks a little funny. And, it took 22 years for us to find out what it was, but she fits all the criteria for this diagnosis. So the doctors were right. There was something else going on. So what does all of this mean? It means I'm a survivor. I have survived 2 brain tumors, a bombing, the loss of a spouse, but I have gained a beautiful daughter, 2 awesome sons, a second chance at marriage, and some real life experiences to help others. I have taken my knowledge of disability topics and personal experiences to be a leader for our Dell True Ability Employee Resource Group. Issues like accessibility, accommodations, benefits, caregiving, mental health, self-ID, mentoring, hiring practices, and neurodiversity are relevant to our Dell employees and the culture of our company. Speaking of neurodiversity, Dell is starting its 3rd year of hiring individuals on the autism spectrum into technical roles. This initiative started within our True Ability ERG, and we've expanded from Boston to Round Rock. We currently have 20 full-time hires that started out going through our cohort into our internship program and coming on as full-time employees. And we're currently having conversations with our partners and vendors to bring jobs to our cafeteria and facilities, with the goal to provide opportunities at all levels of employment. Watching Matthew and Kayla grow into young adults has allowed me to appreciate the need for opportunities for all levels of employment. I often think that I work to keep my personal identity and not just be the special needs mom. I'm glad to work for a company that invests in its employees and that the culture of diversity reflects our customers, our vendors, and our partners. My life is still an insane balancing act. People always ask me how I do it. My response is, I really don't know anything else. I also feel that talking about my story and sharing my mental health issues is one step in keeping that conversation going and helping to reduce the stigma around mental health. The following strategies have helped me balance work while raising a differently abled child or 2. Find support with a family, friend, or respite center. There are days when you have a big meeting and you might need a backup caregiver. Dell provides a benefit that allows all employees to have a set number of days for backup care. And really our employees use it a lot for elder care as well. Talk to your employer. There might be a different position that can accommodate your needs, your flexibility, and maybe stress related to the job that you're in. Make a list of suggestions that can help guide that conversation. What can you do to maybe offer a solution, maybe job sharing or different things like that. Also, talk to your benefits team. They might have resources and benefits to assist. For Dell, we have an autism benefit, and employees that don't have a child with autism might not even realize that this exists unless they need it. So you always ask, hey, what else do you have out there? And check out your company's employee assistance program. With all the anxiety and caregiver burnout due to the COVID-19 right now, this is a perfect time to explore what it has to offer for you and your family. And ask for help. Your company's ERGs are a great resource. Our unspoken rule in the ERG is what happens in the ERG stays in the ERG, because we like to create that safe environment where our employees can go and talk to other people that maybe are sharing the same issues and and gives them a safe place to reach out and have that conversation. I recently completed my master's degree in health advocacy, and it's time to take everything I've learned to help others onto a bigger playing field. Our chief diversity officer and I have an ongoing joke about creating a succession plan when he retires and I take over. Maybe that's not a joke. Thank you for listening, and stay safe, everyone.
Wow, Christine, that was touching and inspiring in many ways. And what stood out for me is, we're all by ourselves in the problems and challenges that we have. But in what I heard you say, there's a number of resources. And what really stuck out was be honest, talk to your employer. If they're of the same kind of thinking or advanced, there's a lot there for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And really right now is the time to have the conversation because there's a lot of change going on in the world.
Right. Yeah. A lot of change. Yeah. The unexpected. That's for sure. So now, Naomi, I'd like to get you in the conversation. What are you seeing in terms of the demands of caregivers? What do you want us to know in terms of, some of the resources that you might be able to tap into today?
Thanks, Michael. And first off, just wanted to say thank you, Chris, for sharing your story. You don't need me to say it, but actually one of the things that can be most helpful, most beneficial, I heard you say this, to caregivers is knowing and understanding other people who have been through this, who are experiencing this, and caregivers as a group, as a community, tend to pull together, tend to identify resources, tend to support one another. And certainly there are so many differences amongst caregivers and types of caregiving that it's a unique and personal, experience for everybody. But, as you stated, it sounds like you've gotten the feedback along the way that being proactive, communicating, and representing the unique needs helps other people also speak up. And then I think employers and others can see that this is not just a unique problem to solve for one person. This is a life that you live every day, and creatively and with resilience and strength. And it's really a benefit to employers as well as employees to come together to sort of solve some of these challenges, and to see the strength and resiliency among kind of the caregiver community generally. So again, some of the things that you talked about in terms of, coming up with creative solutions, in terms of problem solving, in terms of, project management skills that I'm sure come over to your work-life balance at times. There's a lot of familiarity there with what employers generally see amongst caregivers. So thank you for sharing, sharing your experience. It helped really, frame part of our conversation today. So a few themes that I could sort of touch on related to employers as caregivers and caregiving generally. And then I'll talk about some of the kind of COVID specific response and needs that we're seeing right now. So one is, I know that for this group in particular, folks coming to the table for this webinar, you're sort of ahead of the curve in terms of identifying, acknowledging, and really wanting to support the caregivers amongst your employees. So kudos to this group for getting ahead of that and seeing it as a really essential part of the workforce that we need to support creatively and flexibly, but really standardly. There's lots of different types of employees, as well as lots of different types of caregivers, and there's lots of different types of folks who are receiving care. So one of the things you need to think about, or we need to think about, is what are some of the standard approaches, things that we could look at broadly that are sort of have global impact, and then what are the things that are unique for each individual employee. And so folks need the ability to talk about what's going on in their life, to talk about the needs that they have, to be creative and flexible at the manager level around what might be critical for them related to their schedule, but also for employers to be able to just standardly offer, either workshops or employee resource groups or, monthly memos that hit on not only the themes of caregiving, but other types of things that employees might be managing that are kind of presenting, unique behavioral health concerns. This helps normalize and destigmatize, as Chris talked about. When folks are having a harder time than usual, they see it as something that the employer is responsive to. They see themselves as part of a larger group. That can really help. So on the individual basis, knowing and understanding that not all employees are caregivers or types of care is the same, but also standardly making resources available is something that employers in particular can help with this group. Another aspect to really think about is that caregivers not only need resources and support to make sure that the folks under their care are getting the help that they need, but really critically for themselves. And Chris, again, something that you raised a couple of times is there's a huge spectrum of informal to formal support available to caregivers generally for folks under their care, but also for themselves. And employers need to think about the wide range of types of supports that individuals need and be proactive in both benefits management through EAP or making sure that there's comparable behavioral health benefits alongside medical care benefits. So really looking at some of those standards in place, but then also recognizing that informal supports, ways for people to connect to one another, both at work as well as outside of work, amongst other similar caregivers is really going to be critical. And that huge range of types of support will vary depending on the person, depending on their need, and also depending on where they're at in their own, life cycle or other transitions or challenges that might be going on. You might have some caregivers in your employee group right now, or you might be a caregiver right now. And up until, COVID, things were going okay. It might have been stressful, but you might have been finding some time for wellness. You might have had out of home respite that you could access, or someone who was coming into the home. And now all of a sudden those changes are, really sort of tipped what was already a very finely tuned, sort of well-oiled machine, right out the window. And so folks are scrambling and coming up with new things. So more formal support might be indicated right now for individuals who might not be used to accessing it. You might have other folks like Chris who seem like they know how to temperature test and have maybe accessed behavioral health care before. They can see some of those warning signs or triggers that they're approaching burnout, more anxious, more stressed. They might know now's the time to maybe seek help with therapist or counselor. So something that employers can do would be to really have frank conversations. Again, you could do this broadly. It doesn't have to be at an individual level, but helping people know and understand what are the different types of care that are available. How has that changed since, COVID? More folks are, working with telebehavioral health, or psychiatric care can be accessed remotely. A lot of the support groups or resources that folks are connected in among kind of Caregiver Alliance and Coalition are offering sort of web-based peer support. So there's lots of opportunities and options, but employees and individuals generally don't always know how to evaluate amongst all of that what's right for me right now. So education around when to access something that might be more formal, when to, think about how to, seek behavioral health counseling when needed. Again, you can broadly educate your employees without having to ask maybe some of those individual personal questions that, folks more from an HR perspective might be, not wanting to push in on. And people need to know what quality, behavioral health care looks like, and the transparency that you should expect from a provider. Some people, don't know and understand that a therapist should be talking to you about what they think your diagnosis is. If we're going to give a formal diagnosis, what is the treatment plan? How is this treatment plan and this type of care supposed to help you with what you're going through right now? And that it really should be a mutual shared decision so that and can engage with care that's really of high quality. And I think that that's something that employers can be in a position of helping educate generally around, so people know what to access and how to access the different levels of care, in addition to just supplying it. And I know that Jan is going to talk a little bit more about some of the standard, additional options that are available. But from that behavioral health perspective, education about good care, quality care, what to expect is definitely something that folks can benefit right now. And then I'll just say one other thing and then kind of pass it back, Michael. I know we'll have further question and discussion. But really, since COVID, I'll just sort of talk about some of the themes or some of the things you might want to be aware of or think about. Again, in the idea that not all caregivers or receivers of care are the same. Caring for someone who's medically at risk right now of becoming seriously ill from coronavirus or COVID is something that should be critical in terms of our sense of evaluation. The level of anxiety, of risk, of precautions, of change in the home lifestyle is really different for individuals and individuals caring for folks who are medically at risk, as opposed to caregivers who might not be caring for someone in that acute risk population. So it's just something to be aware of in terms of stress or anxiety response. individuals are generally getting far less breaks and far less of their standard health. And so what does that look like at an individual basis, and how to really make sure that people have daily kind of stress management, self-care techniques and tips at hand. Again, you can disseminate broadly amongst employees. It doesn't have to be caregiver specific. The things we have to think about for caregivers are, is it reasonable for them to come to a 1-hour webinar on a day that they're actually, taking care of somebody all day? And if that's their only hour break, or if that's their only time that they're actually getting some respite, does it mean that maybe our video norms might be video off so that they could eat their lunch at the same time or stand up and walk around? So we need to think a little bit creatively around how much pressure is on the day-to-day life of folks. And again, standard education and dissemination of self-care or mindfulness or relaxation, they are generally really good short-term strategies for sort of anchoring and helping ground and stress. But this is a long-going, shifting situation, and we need to be critically aware of the stress levels as they rise for different populations, including caregivers. Just making sure that we're kind of broadly educating, but really making people aware of the unique individual available resources when they're at a moment that they need more formalized help.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. Now, something that I've heard about caregivers is that many people who are giving care or have the going on in outside work, they don't identify themselves as caregivers. I heard you say a lot of really great things that could help a caregiver. How do you maybe help somebody understand that they are a caregiver? And once they realize that, there's a lot of resources for them. What might you say about that?
And I think individuals, it sounds like from Chris's story, and this is something that you can hear, fairly typically, sometimes caregiving is something that just happens along the way. And all of a sudden you realize your life is completely different than it was before, but maybe because it happened in incremental stages, it didn't quite occur to you that this is almost another full-time job. They're used to problem solving, finding the next resource, finding the next strategy. And then maybe all of a sudden they turn around and realize this is taking up much more of my day or my time than I realized, even when I have other folks. So part of it might be, evaluation or assessment of time spent doing certain things, how much management there is of other folks that are involved in someone's care. Is an individual under your care able to access regular out-of-home resources, and what does that look like? And also time spent ensuring that the right benefits and resources are in place. That's something that'll be shifting right now for many caregivers. Financial stress and concern, especially related to losing benefits, is something that's going to hit your caregiver employee population much more acutely than some folks who might not have some of the same concerns over disruptions of care or long-term care or those types of things. So folks who are aware that they're finding resources, procuring resources, spending much of their time making sure that an individual that's part of their family network or otherwise, it has what they need. Those are the types of things that you would probably standardly assess for to help folks identify whether they're in this sort of kind of unpaid, formal caregiver role.
Thank you, Naomi. Now we're going to get Jen in the conversation. Jen, what's your perspective from an elder care tack on this topic? What would you like us to know?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. And it was really educational for me to listen to Christine's story and to listen to Naomi's perspective. And the one takeaway that I have that we see in our communities and with our consumers is that there are no two caregiver stories that are exactly the same. There are no two caregivers that are the same. As you mentioned, Michael, many people don't even identify as a caregiver. I'm just a daughter, I'm a son, I'm a spouse, I'm a parent. This is what I do. This is my role. And sometimes it's not so important that we put that label on them, that we put that tag on them, but instead that we talk about what are the needs that they have, or what are the resources that we have that might help them to enhance their role, to feel less stress and less burden as a result of the challenges that they have in front of them. I think we've seen so much change in the last few years around what the caregivers look like. Hearing Christine's story was really compelling. Many of the caregivers that we talk with are the parents or the spouses of older adults, adults with disabilities, adults with multiple chronic care conditions, and they're really balancing that need to be providing care for their loved one, as well as providing for their own well-being, their own mental health. And a lot of times there's some anxiety and stress and even guilt that goes along with creating that balance. Some anxiety about what the future is going to hold. That anxiety is super heightened now that we're in COVID and no one knows what the future is going to hold. Some stress around how they balance caregiving for their parent and their children and do their work from home. And sometimes some guilt, even guilt that maybe they feel like they should be doing more and they can't be doing more. Or sometimes guilt that at times they may feel resentful. This is not what I envisioned my life looking like. And now I have to care for a spouse with Alzheimer's. How do they balance all of those challenges? So it might be easy for us to think about this sort of menu of resources that we can provide for older adults or their caregivers. But I think it's important to first really think about who that caregiver is as an individual and talk to them specifically about what they need. Sometimes it might be that they just need a break, that they just need some professional to come in, provide a respite service so that they can go and do some of their errands, or God forbid that they can go see a movie with their friend. That kind of resource is something that works really well. For other people, the idea of another trained professional or a stranger coming into the home and providing care adds to that anxiety. So respite isn't going to be a nice resource for them. Instead, it might be some additional education or some training or some one-on-one counseling or therapy, as Naomi and others have talked about, to help them understand the balance between their own self-care and the care that they provide for their loved ones. We like to think of that analogy that we all hear when we were flying. We're not doing that now, but we were flying around putting on your own mask before you put on the mask for someone that you care for. It's a really hard thing to think about, but when we start talking with people who are providing family caregiver support services for their loved ones, that almost feels like a relief sometimes, that we're giving them permission to do things that are going to help them, because at the end, that is going to help them be the caregiver that they want to be for their loved ones. Right now, I think we're also seeing, in addition to caregiving for older adults, particularly people with Alzheimer's or dementia, we're seeing that many older adults themselves are newly becoming caregivers. They thought their caregiving responsibilities were done when their children were out of the house. But the largest increase in the number of family caregivers that we're seeing are grandparents who are caring for grandchildren, particularly when we think about the opioid epidemic and the challenge that that has created for many families. So then not only are they older themselves and having their own physical and mental health challenges potentially, but they're also caring for this grandchild. And in some cases, many cases, they're still working. So they're having these additional balances. So I would say for any employer, when you start thinking about the kind of caregiver resources that you want to provide, keep in mind the need that those resources do have to be very individually tailored. And there are a lot of organizations out there who are already doing this work. So don't feel like you have to recreate the wheel. We're an area agency on aging. There are more than 25 of the area agencies on aging across the country, across the state, and hundreds across the country. They cover every geographic area. So you can call us at 1-800-AGE-INFO, and I'll put that in the chat for folks, and try to find out what are the different caregiver resources that are available in the communities that you serve. So there definitely are resources out there, and we just encourage people to not look at it as a one-size-fits-all.
That was terrific, Jen. You know, I have an equation for you and for others as well. You know, I wanted to highlight what we're talking about here around caregiving, but also how does the COVID-19 come in? So the equation is stress plus COVID-19, you know, equals what? Is that a very different kind of reality, or are things still similar in terms of dealing with stress?
So all of those challenges, all of that anxiety and stress that normally goes along with being a caregiver is still there. Now it seems to be, we're hearing from many of our consumers that it's heightened, particularly heightened when it comes to caring with someone who has Alzheimer's or related dementia and may not understand, gosh, why is it that people are not coming to visit me anymore? What is all this concern about wearing masks? Why do I have to be in my home and isolated the entire time? And so trying to navigate those waters, in addition to the general challenges around caregiving for someone with Alzheimer's disease or dementia, just heightens the challenge and heightens the stress. We've all seen the stories in the paper about nursing homes that are isolating in order to protect older adults, assisted living and public housing that are limiting the number of visitors that can come in. So that's creating additional stress and anxiety, not just for the caregiver, but for the caregivee. And, we're all anxious about what the future holds now. So we can only imagine how that anxiety is compounded when you have a lack of connection or a lack of information about what's happening with your caregiving.
Yeah, what stuck out for me is it's compounded. It's all the stress of every day. I don't know, maybe times 10, times 100. Yeah. So I'm going to check in and see if we have any questions that might be coming in. Chris, is that something that we've got right now? Otherwise, I've got another question.
Thanks, Michael. I think we've got a couple of comments in the chat section, and just wondered, one of them is to all the panelists, if there are any resources, websites that they can access for caregivers. So folks are grateful for Jen, you sharing the 1-800-AGE info in the chat. If other resources are available, or you think of other websites or links, we'll try to link those as well, but maybe you could comment, panelists, on the ones that you've found most helpful.
Thanks, Chris. Why don't we pick it up there? Christine, what have you found most useful?
So, I've gone the gamut from pediatrics all the way to geriatrics when I had my dad with me as well. And I think it's been kind of putting the pieces together, utilizing your private insurance. And I have found that using a case manager, depending on the individual, whether it's Kayla, Matthew, or my dad, what other services are out there, and being able to have that dialogue. So putting together that I guess quilt of public and private services to fill those gaps. And both Jen and Naomi talk about respite and taking a break. I've been very fortunate in the past to be able to utilize some of those respite services, and I know it's probably changed going forward, but again, how can we be creative in order to take that time to have that break? Because I find for myself, I can't be a good caregiver if I don't get, a good night's sleep once in a while, or 20 minutes to go take a shower with nobody knocking on the door, and little things like that make a big difference.
Yeah, just creating some space for a moment. And, it's so true, Jen, that it's tough to see the logic of putting the air mask on you first, rather than the children or the other adults that you might be with. I think a lot of people in the airlines would see that done wrong, and we see it in our everyday lives as well. We've got to keep gas in the tank in order to be good caregivers, right? Anything to say about that,
Absolutely.
Jennifer?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's not intuitive. It feels like it should be the opposite if you're especially a caregiver, like you want to put that person first. So sometimes it helps for caregivers to participate in support groups or trainings with people who had similar circumstances. We've been so lucky in Massachusetts to have a really powerful Executive Office of Elder Affairs that sees the need to support family caregivers and has helped build an infrastructure across the state for programs like a program like Savvy Caregiver, so that caregivers can go to this program either in person or now remotely and learn those kinds of skills. How do I become the caregiver that I really want to be while maintaining my own sanity and my own well-being? For other people, it's programs like the memory cafes that are all over the state. These memory cafes used to be in person, now they're all pivoting to remote, where the caregiver and the caregivee can participate together and listen to music and, communicate with one another, but have this feeling of, I'm not in this alone. There are other people. So all of these resources are things that certainly are available and can help caregivers to better comprehend or begin to comprehend those challenges and why it is so important for them to put that mask on first.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Naomi, I'm going to pass it over to you and ask you a very similar question around how do you recommend people keep that gas in the tank, how they keep that energy going, their mood up, and have some more energy to care for others. What do you recommend?
Yeah, well, I just also wanted to say in terms of resources that the National Alliance for Caregiving, which is caregiving.org, is a great national, place to send folks. They have a very rich resources specific section for COVID-19 right now. I think, as Chris said, depending on the challenge of the caregivee or what they might be managing, there's a lot of very specific targeted COVID-19 specific resources that are available, autism, Alzheimer's, and otherwise. And so you sort of have to go to the condition level to find some of those specific things, but that's a great clearinghouse on caregiving.org to find some additional information and support. And I think, as evidenced sort of by this conversation, it's balancing making sure that caregivers have the right access and resources for those under their care, as well as not forgetting that they need to have the right access to resources for themselves. And so how to support the true need of finding what's relevant, available for folks under their care is one of the ways to help manage long-term anxiety, stress, and burnout. We need things in place for the people under their care. So how to make sure that we're supporting that, but then not losing sight that they need attention and care and support themselves. So finding that balance. Some of the things that seem very basic is just encouraging individuals to notice the normal things that they might be doing to take care of themselves and looking for particular disruptions and places that they can incrementally put achievable steps in place to take care of themselves. Things that you might be looking for would be like, sleep disruption right now, which is widespread. So are folks getting adequate sleep? Are there adequate times for meals? Are there adequate times for exercise? So the basic building blocks that help folks just remain well, even under normal circumstances. Again, it's a well-oiled machine in many homes of caregivers to find the time for these basic areas. So individuals knowing and identifying what are the things that I need on a daily basis, and how to make sure that we're helping get that in place structurally. And I think what Jen has raised a couple of times is really critical and important, is that part of normal caregiver wellness is learning about boundaries, is learning about the self-care, like taking time for myself, taking time to thrive, taking time to enjoy, taking time outside of my home when I can, or inside my home that is not about caregiving. Those all help with, ongoing, mental health and wellness. And so what does that look like now when folks are finding less time to take those breaks, making sure people have tips and resources of how to, think about the guilt that they might feel by taking time now more than ever, and normalizing that experience and helping people overcome it so that they don't forget or lose sight of their own wellness as really being critical in order to continue to do what they love for their families and loved ones, but also continue to engage meaningfully at work. And I would also, just recommend, especially for at the manager or HR level, as we said earlier, folks are going to be critically aware of, maybe more so than some other folks, of potential for job loss or reorganization or structuring, especially if they're, using benefits that are available through their employer in particular in terms of caregiving. And so if there's, you might see some lateness or irritability, there might be things that let you know that a person in particular is really having a harder time. So I would just encourage, to the extent that folks are able to, reach out proactively, ask in weekly meetings, how are you doing? What's going on in your home? What's the week been like for you? Just sort of normalizing that conversation so that if you do see somebody kind of in more distress, you might be able to guide towards appropriate resources, as you can. And you may also want to consider like standard, employee survey during this time so that you're able to know for different categories of employees, how is the stress level? Are there changes in some of these normal patterns? You might be able to target some resources, based on sort of some of that aggregate information. So just some kind of individual as well as maybe some more general things of what to think about for folks right now.
Well, thanks for that, Naomi. Chris, yeah.
We just got another question, and I want to direct this partly to you, Michael, and Christine and the other panelists. Someone with a good insight here, looking for ideas, ways that thoughts on how managers can engage and better support caregivers on their teams. Aside from just HR and EAP, how do you see managers operating in the workforce and really engaging with employees? And I know you have some great experiences at RockFit, at Rockland Trust, Michael. So I don't know if you want to start that off, and others can then jump in.
Yeah, sure. So at Rockland Trust, we're a strong growing bank in Eastern Massachusetts. And with that growth, we've taken a real interest in helping people with their wellness. And that's their physical, emotional, and financial wellness. And when we get into conversations like that, it's very helpful. And there's a lot of programming that goes around it as well for employees to engage in, learn more things. I think as organizations grow and our town commons shrink and our porches go from the front to the back of the house, we're looking at workplaces being that place where people can congregate and create community. We call it a community of caregivers. And that's very important to us, is to create that community. And as you can imagine, it has a lot of benefits. Turnover, attrition, satisfaction, working at Rockland Trust. And I think people really enjoy it. We actually get emails saying, I don't do any of the programs, but I love that you have them. It shows me that leadership around here cares. And I think that is very important. Caregivers need to know that they're cared for as well. And the company is a great place to make that start. I wonder what the panelists might have to say about that.
I'll add that Dell has 13 employee resource groups, and one of them it used to be called Caregivers. It's now called Family Balance, and it's actually a global employee resource group. And so they do a great job helping educate. And we do a lot of cross collaborations amongst the employee resource groups. So whether it's True Abilities and the caregivers having activities together, maybe we add the veterans in, because there's a lot of cross collaboration there that, maybe you're the spouse and your husband has come back from active duty and maybe has a disability because of that. And you're caring for them. You're also a veteran. Now there's a disability added in there. So we do a lot to share information as well as provide those brown bag lunches to our managers saying, hey, you may have a team member that is caring for an elderly parent that's dealing with dementia. And, Susie might be coming in late on Wednesday mornings because she has to get dad on the van to go to an adult day program. And so we do a lot to educate in that space.
Well, thank you for that, Christine. And now I'm getting the cues that we're going to turn it over. It's been a great program. Thanks for sharing your perspectives, your stories. I really appreciate it. I found it very inspiring. So now we're going to turn things over to Lawrence Stuntz, and Lawrence will tell us about follow-up actions, including a survey. Lawrence, over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks so much to Christine and Naomi and Jennifer for all of your stories and your tips, and just helping to share with folks who are really maybe struggling with some of these issues. We launched, my name is Lawrence Stuntz. I'm the director of the Massachusetts eHealth Institute at the Mass Tech Collaborative. And along with the Business Roundtable and Elder Affairs and private organizations like Cigna, Dell, in fact, EMC or EMD Serono, Archangels, and others, we launched the Massachusetts Caregiver Coalition to really help employers develop strategies to recognize the caregivers who work for them, to honor those caregivers, and then to support those caregivers. And so in this time of COVID, we've pivoted from a large in-person summit that was supposed to be in late April to this webinar series that we've gotten some really great responses on. You see a poll on your screen right now that is helping to ask what would be most interesting for you to hear us or hear us develop a program around next. So thank you for filling that out. When you do close out of the webinar, we do have a poll that pops up that would allow a little bit more flexibility in just telling us what's on your mind. Did you, what can we help with? And I would also encourage you to go to the Business Roundtable's caregiving, the Caregiver Coalition site on the Mass Business Roundtable, businessroundtable.org/caregiving. And then we can go to, and we can help provide you resources. So I see a question in the chat. What if you're interested in all the options? Pick one and tell us about it in the closing survey poll. So thank you very much for all of your time today. We look forward to engaging with you, and we look forward to you and your organizations joining the coalition. So please reach out to us. Thanks all.